I'm a female corrections officer in a state with a relatively high number of death row inmates, though few executions are actually carried out. I used to work for a large county before I transferred to a different agency. That county jail was my first job as a CO, and I was really green back then. I had no prior experience other than retail and customer service, all while studying criminal justice. To say the job changed my perspective is an understatement. Back then, I truly believed no human could be inherently evil. That belief didn't last long. The jail I worked at was one of the oldest in the country, with parts of it designed in a linear layout. A long stretch of corridor with cells on either side, like something out of an old movie. The COs had to walk up and down to supervise the inmates, but the design was flawed. You couldn't see every cell at once, but every inmate could see you. It was creepy, to say the least. We called that corridor the condos. One of the most unsettling experiences I ever had happened in those condos. It was less than 10 years ago when a quadruple homicide occurred not far from where I grew up. The murderer, a man named Michael, described his crime as a butchering. He had killed his ex-girlfriend, her family, and their neighbor, who had come over to check on the screams. When the police found Michael, drenched in blood, and asked what had happened, he simply said, "It's obvious. I killed them." The officer later said he was emotionless when he said it. At the time, I'd only been working at the jail for about 4 months, and Michael was brought in as a pretrial detainee. His crime stood out not just because of the brutality, but because of how detached he seemed. We put him in an observation cell in the middle of the condos, where we could keep an eye on him. Most of the day, he stood at his glass door in silence, just watching us. His visits were strange too, always full of goth girls claiming they were in love with him. One day, I was working as a utility officer, which is basically a floater, and I was hanging out at the far end of the condos, talking to another officer. We were being quiet, just chatting about the weekend, nothing too personal, but you could never be too careful. Still, we were a good 50 yards away from Michael's observation cell, and I didn't think much of it. I wrapped up my conversation because I needed to go relieve another officer. As I passed by Michael's cell, I heard him whisper, "Edgecombe," my last name, caught me off guard. I stopped, turned, and walked back to the door. He pointed to his mouth, motioning for me to lean in. I did. His eyes were dark, like they were pulling me in. And then he started reciting word for word the story I had just told the officer down the hall. He mimicked the tone of my voice, the way I spoke, down to the subtle lisp I hadn't even realized I had. It went on for what felt like forever. In that moment, it was like there was no glass between us. Just me, standing there helpless, while he repeated every detail. For the first time, I thought to myself, this is evil, pure evil. Finally, I snapped out of it and said, "Sir, did you need something?" He just started laughing hysterically, and I walked away as fast as I could. I've been assaulted by inmates, had things thrown at me, dealt with mind games, but this was something else entirely. I work at a maximum security prison now, dealing with murderers and sex offenders, but I'll never forget Michael. He's on death row now, and he refuses to appeal. He's not sorry, he just doesn't care. This story takes place in a small town in the Northeast, during the summer before I went off to college in 2015. My parents had decided to move to a smaller house, about 45 minutes north into the mountains, after I graduated from high school. The property taxes on our old house had become too much for them to handle. It was a beautiful new place, nestled in the woods with a driveway that was 1.5 miles long. Not many neighbors, just a lot of green trees and wildlife. We moved in that August, and to celebrate, my parents threw a housewarming party. We invited family friends, and I had my best friend over as well. It was a fun day, barbecuing, playing with the dogs, talking about football, and laughing the day away. My dad had even built a fire pit in the backyard. As the night came, my best friend and I decided to stay outside by the fire pit to roast s'mores. My dog, Nino, a 100-pound black lab pit bull mix, sat between us, facing the tree line. He was our protector, trained by my dad, and I trusted him completely. It was a peaceful night until Nino started growling. His ears perked up, and he sat straight, staring into the dark trees behind us. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was probably a deer or some other animal. This area was known for wildlife, but when he started barking viciously, like I'd never heard before, we both jumped up. I shined my phone's flashlight toward the trees. That's when we saw him, a man. He was hiding behind a tree, peering out at us. He was wearing a green shirt and green pants, about 5 feet 11 inches, with glasses. We screamed and ran inside, slamming the door behind us. My mom was in the kitchen cleaning up from the party, and we frantically told her what we'd seen. My dad immediately grabbed his shotgun and headed outside with Nino. My mom called 911 while we huddled together in the living room, terrified. A few minutes later, we heard my dad come back inside, but no sign of the man. The police arrived shortly after. A whole team of officers, SWAT, and even a helicopter circling the area. That's when we found out the terrifying truth. The man we saw was an escaped convict from a prison about 20 miles away. He had been on the run for days, hiding in the mountains. The all-green outfit he was wearing was a dead giveaway. It was the standard prison uniform. The officers searched the woods around our house for hours, but didn't find him. They left a squad car to watch our house for the next few days, just in case. We spent the next 3 nights sleeping in the living room together, my dad's shotgun always within reach. Eventually, the officers came back to tell us they had caught the man, and we were safe. But we weren't taking any chances after that. My parents spent thousands on security cameras and fencing for the backyard. To this day, I don't know what would have happened if Nino hadn't warned us. Sometimes you just never know what's lurking in the dark. When I was 18, I worked at a local Target. Back then, we had a wall next to the registers filled with Pokemon, baseball, and collectible cards. There was a Starbucks right in front of the registers by the front doors for context. I'm a female, so what happened to me made it all the more disturbing. One day, I was stocking this wall with more cards when an awkward, tall man approached. He started looking at the Pokemon section next to me. He asked, "Do you like Pokemon?" And I casually responded, "Yes." This led to a brief conversation about the game, but I didn't think much of it. He picked out some cards, checked out, and left. 3 days later, the same man returned to the store, found me, and bought me some candy. He handed it to me, smiled, and said, "Have a nice day." That's when things started escalating. He began coming in frequently, looking for me, and eventually started sitting at the Starbucks tables, watching me while I worked. Every time he came in, he'd bring more candy, Starbucks drinks, flowers, and then things got even weirder. He started giving me little girl panties, pacifiers, and baby hair accessories. Now I was freaked out. I tried telling my bosses, but they couldn't do anything about it. They said they called the cops, but the police couldn't act either. One day, he followed me to the back room when I tried to leave the registers to avoid him. That's when we were finally able to call the cops, because he cornered me back there. Thankfully, some stockroom guys were around and basically saved me. We managed to get a restraining order that prevented him from entering the store. But that didn't stop him. Instead, he started waiting outside for me. He'd follow me to my car and leave love notes on my vehicle. It was terrifying, and while my mom knew about it, nothing we did seemed to stop him. One day, things escalated even further. He followed me home from work. I had never seen his car until that day, but he parked outside my house and started singing love songs and reading poems he wrote for me, loudly. My mom called the police, and we both kept telling him to leave. When the cops finally arrived, they managed to get him to go, but it didn't stop there. He began sending me letters and packages filled with disturbing items, pornographic outfits, little girl panties, baby stuff. My mom and I were desperately trying to get a restraining order and press charges for harassment, but it seemed like nothing was working. One night, he attacked me. He had waited around the corner of my house, and when I got home, he grabbed me, covering my face, and dragged me to the ground. I screamed so loudly that neighbors came rushing out to help. That's when he was finally arrested. After gathering enough evidence, we took him to court. He's been in jail for 8 years now, and he's due for release in 2021. I later learned that he was stalking another local girl too. We connected after he was sent away, and thankfully, she never got hurt. Back in the 1960s, my dad worked as a guard at a prison near Miami. He recently told me about one of the most chilling experiences he had during his time there, involving a prisoner he compared to a young Hannibal Lecter. This guy was calm, always composed, but deeply menacing. There was something about him that made you feel uneasy, even though he never raised his voice or showed any outward aggression. One day, this inmate, Lecter, managed to start a riot in his cell block. But what made it so terrifying was that he didn't participate at all. Instead, he stirred up every other prisoner, getting them into a frenzy without so much as lifting a finger himself. He just stood there, in his cell, calm as ever, while everyone around him was screaming, banging on their cell doors, throwing themselves against the walls. My dad and a few other guards were called down to quiet things down. Every prisoner was shouting and cursing at them, except for Lecter. He was the only quiet one in the whole block. When my dad approached his cell, Lecter was standing at the back, hands folded, staring directly at him with a strange smile. He was muttering something under his breath, but my dad couldn't make it out at first. Then it hit him. Lecter was repeating a sequence of numbers, my dad's home phone number, over and over again, in a calm, almost hypnotic voice, with that eerie smile still on his face. My dad stood there, frozen, trying to figure out how this guy knew his phone number. But he couldn't stay there long. There was a riot to deal with, and he had to close Lecter's cell. But as he did, Lecter just kept staring, kept smiling, and kept repeating those numbers. I was 21 years old, working as a corrections officer in a maximum security prison on the night shift. This was back in 2019, July 4th to be exact. I worked in the maximum general population area, where each inmate had their own cell. These were the worst of the worst, murderers and all sorts of people you don't want to meet. That evening, I had spent time with my wife and family, grilling, blowing up fireworks, and just enjoying the holiday. My wife had told me to call in sick, to stay home with her and the family, but I said no. We were behind on bills, and I couldn't afford to miss a day of work. I really wish I had listened to her. I got to work, got my gear, and began my shift. Everything was going as usual, showering the inmates, locking them up, getting the night cleaning crew out. I was in the officer station with my partner, getting briefed when another officer came in to join us. There were now 3 of us in the cell house. That's when we heard it, a cackling sound, like a witch's laugh. It was strange, but not entirely unusual. Drugs were always a problem in the facility. I decided to check it out, thinking someone might be high. I walked through and checked all 200 inmates, nothing. A few were awake, but none of them were laughing. I brushed it off and returned to the office. After another round, I noticed an inmate acting weird, facing the wall and talking to himself. He was in cell 218. At first, I thought he was just high or had some mental issues, but when he turned and told me to, expletive off, I decided to have his cell searched. 2 officers went to pull him out, and I watched from below. The inmate took forever to get out of his cell, which made me uneasy. He was a big guy, 6 feet tall, 250 pounds of muscle. He was wearing just shorts and a do-rag, and I could feel something was off. When he finally came out, I tried to keep the situation calm, offering to let him use the phone or check his commissary. He declined, which never happens. That's when I saw it, the Samsung logo reflecting in his do-rag. He had a cell phone. I called for backup over the radio, and 2 more officers came. I told the inmate to turn around and cuff up, but instead, he pulled out a 6-inch sharpened metal rod. He charged at me. Time slowed down. I remember thinking, this is it. I'm going to die. He stabbed at me, fast and repeatedly. I managed to block his blows, but then he aimed for my chest. I felt it, the blade hit me. I screamed, "Spray him," and the officer sprayed him with OC spray. 1 officer grabbed him, but the inmate fought back, trying to throw him over the edge of the 2nd-story railing. In the chaos, I called for backup, and more officers arrived. They managed to subdue him, but not before I was stabbed 4 times. Once in the chest, twice in my left hand, and once in my arm. I was rushed to the ER, and luckily, the blade missed my lungs by inches. I didn't sleep for 2 days after the attack. I still have nightmares. Out of 37 plunges, I'm lucky to be here writing this story.